Horror is one of my favorite genres in movies, books, and video games. I was first introduced to it in the mid-2000s with Silent Hill 2. My first experience was something like this.
Damn nigga, what you doing out here with all this ass?
I'm about to bust.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
It was beautiful. Since then, I became obsessed with survival horror and started playing as many as I could get my hands on. Having spent much time with the genre, I thought it was time for me to do something I wanted to do since I started making YouTube videos. And that is, document the history of survival horror. In this video, I plan to look at the genre from its early conception to the explosion of popularity, the decline, and then rise again. And along the way, take a look at all the changes the genre underwent. So without further ado, let's start from the beginning.
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
You're wounded. What kind of demon attack?
Resident Evil is cited as being the game to popularize and basically create survival horror. But there are games that predate Resident Evil that experiment with horror, and some of these would introduce mechanics and gameplay elements that would go on to be staples of the genre. You can trace the roots as far back as the early 80s. Nostromo, released in 1981 and only in Japan, was inspired by the 1979 movie Alien. In this game, you must sneak around a spaceship, avoiding an alien, collecting items to open doorways so you can escape. Haunted House, released in 1982 for the Atari 2600, you explore a house while avoiding ghosts, bats, and spiders, all while solving puzzles. To be able to find the items, you must light a match by pressing the only button on the joystick. Malcolm Evans' 3D Monster Maze. Also released in 1982, it was a first-person game and all you have to do is find your way out of a maze while a T-Rex stalks and looks for you. At the bottom of the screen, it tells you what the T-Rex is doing as you try to find your way out. Those are some of the earliest examples, but the three most notable ones are Sweet Home, Alone in the Dark, and Clock Tower. Sweet Home was an RPG published by Capcom with a focus on horror and survival. It's considered to be the first true survival horror game because of its close ties to Resident Evil, we'll get to that, but how it also laid the groundwork by focusing on puzzle solving, exploration, its use of telling a story through notes, backtracking to previous areas with new items, a limited inventory system, and survival with a permadeath system. If a character died, they were gone for the rest of the game. The director of Sweet Home would go on to become a producer on Resident Evil. Alone in the Dark was published by Atari in 1992 and would use fixed camera angles as you explored, solve puzzles, find keys, read notes, and fight or run from enemies. We can see that we're getting closer to what the genre would become in just a few short years with the 3D models and fixed camera angles and combining elements from the earlier titles. And that's why many consider Alone in the Dark a forefather of survival horror. Clock Tower released in 1995 and was a side-scrolling point-and-click game that focused on runaway instead of fighting. You explore a mansion while trying to avoid the Scissor Man, who you can compare to Mr. X or Nemesis with the way he stalks you throughout the game and pops up seemingly at random, causing you to have to run away. There were also many other games released around the same time that you could say played a part in helping mold the genre, like Project Firestarter, Dr. Hauser, and D. I would also like to mention that horror-themed video games were around too, Castlevania, Splatterhouse, and Friday the 13th, but most of them had their own completely different types of gameplay and were different genres. But I feel like mentioning it to show that a lot of developers want to implement some horror themes into their games. So, those are the roots of survival horror, and the stage was set for the genre to explode in popularity in 1996 with Resident Evil. Resident Evil opened the floodgates and started the golden era of survival horror, and this is when the genre really started to take form and gain attention. It provided a template that many games would follow afterwards. It popularized the phrase survival horror and even used it in its advertising. The game was originally supposed to be a remake of Sweet Home, even with the same director of that game working on this project. The idea was to fully expand on the ideas introduced in Sweet Home, but after losing the rights to the name, they had to change it, so the title Resident Evil was chosen. There's also a line in Sweet Home where a character says Resident Evil, probably just a coincidence, but I thought it was neat. Resident Evil took elements from its predecessors, such as the puzzle solving, inventory and resource management, tough enemies, backtracking, notes, and combined them into a classic that introduced the genre to new players. During this time, we would not only see more Resident Evil sequels and spin-offs, but more releases from series that predate Resident Evil. That meant more Clock Tower and Alone in the Dark games now releasing to a wider audience interested in the genre. Capcom themselves even made another horror game similar to Resident Evil with Dino Crisis. But of course, there were games that were just Resident Evil clones and trying to cash in on the genre's new newfound popularity. But there are also many other unique horror games doing their own thing and becoming classics in their own right. Parasite Eve, which is a role-playing game with a lot of horror elements. Silent Hill, taking a completely different approach from its predecessors by becoming psychological horror. And there was also System Shock 2, with its unique setting and very deep gameplay. All these games would go on to influence the genre for decades to come. Throughout the 90s, we would see more and more horror games, and the success continued into the early 2000s with the 6th generation of consoles. This is where we'll see even more sequels to now established franchises, and even more new IPs like Fatal Frame, Eternal Darkness, Siren, and Manhunt leaving their own mark on the genre as well. One reason why fans consider this the golden age is because of the amount of horror games coming out and how many did their own thing. This is also around the same time where we see some absolute classics of the genre. Very influential games that are well respected and praised to this day. At this point, there were still many games that stuck close to what Resident Evil started in the 90s, but there was variety in different games putting their own spin on it. Eternal Darkness with its fourth wall breaking scares. Fatal Frame with its use of a camera that battled ghosts. Obscure feeling like a cheesy over-the-top slasher movie. Siren with being able to jump to the POV of the enemies as you try to sneak past. Manhunt with being over-the-top violence with the appearance of a snuff film. And many, many more. Hell, even Doom, a series that was known for being a first-person shooter, dabbled in horror for a bit. Needless to say, it was a great time to be a horror fan, but all good things don't last forever.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
In 2005, Resident Evil 4 released, and just like they did in 1996, they shook up and changed gaming. Resident Evil 4 introduced an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective and focused much more on action, and was also one of the games that popularized QuickTime events. Though it did keep some horror elements like the limited inventory system, it still prioritized action over the scares, shifting into what fans call an action horror genre, and this is also what people call the beginning of the slow death of AAA survival horror. There were still some very solid horror games released after Resident Evil 4, but it didn't take long for the industry to change to start accommodating for more action-oriented experiences. Both Silent Hill and Alone in the Dark followed suit and tried making their own action-focused horror game. And because of the success of Resident Evil 4, Capcom shifted their focus of the entire franchise, steering further and further away from horror. There's also the Fear games and Dead Space. Though both are very solid series, they also focused more on action than providing scares. And there was less and less horror games being released every year from these big developers. And these new entries in these franchises started straying further away from their roots. It was also around this time that many publishers didn't see survival horror as being as popular as it was or as profitable. So to many fans, mainstream AAA survival horror was dead. With the decline of horror in the mainstream, fans had to look elsewhere to get their fix, and that's when indie games started to pump life back into the genre. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, indie PC games like Penumbra, Cry of Fear, Amnesia the Dark Descent, Slender the 8 Pages, Five Nights at Freddy's, Outlast, Eerie, and horror mods started to grow in popularity. Some of these were popular enough to start launching the careers of Let's Players. As the AAA horror titles started to drop in quality, indie games provided fans what they wanted the most, genuinely scary experiences. And some of these games gained enough popularity that they even got ported to the consoles for more to experience. A lot of these indie games were labeled as walking simulators or hide-and-seek horror because of having no combat system and focusing more on running, and providing a more atmospheric experience. The success of these games got the attention of big developers who saw the potential in survival horror again. Capcom remastered some of its classic horror titles like the Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil Zero, as well as releasing Revelations, which was one of the best received Resident Evil games by fans in years. So thanks to these indie developers and indie horror games and fans, by the mid-2010s, horror was again on the rise. In 2014, we saw a big spark in AAA horror games, with publishers starting to focus on them again. Alien Isolation and The Evil Within would lead the charge in late 2014 as being a return to form and going back to the roots, both implementing and revamping staples of the genre, both featuring tough and challenging gameplay, resource management, and in Alien Isolation's case, only being able to save your game at designated save points. The PT demo for Silent Hill's release, along with the trailers, to much praise and anticipation. Indie studios were now releasing games outside just the PC and making deals with Sony and Microsoft, allowing more players to pick these games up on their PS4 and Xbox Ones. And going back to The Evil Within, that was directed and created by Shinji Mikami, creator of the Resident Evil franchise, and directed numbers 1 through 4. He created The Evil Within because he was disappointed to what the genre had become, and wanted to bring survival horror back to its roots. So he knew exactly how the fans felt. And from this point on, we started getting even more horror games, with some studios just centered around just making them. Frictional Games, Red Barrel Games, Bloober Team, just to name a few. And Capcom even released a sequel to its well-received Revelations with Resident Evil Revelations 2, really starting to shift their focus back into survival horror. And in 2017, Capcom released Resident Evil 7, which is their highest selling Resident Evil game ever, and is also the second best selling game in Capcom's history. They then would go on to remake Resident Evil 2 and 3, proving that they are now more focused than ever on making horror games. Still waiting on you, Konami. Fucking do something. And here we are now, over 25 years since Resident Evil dropped and brought survival horror to the mainstream. This genre has some ups and some downs, but I personally believe that right now in 2020 is probably the best time to be a horror fan. There's more development teams and studios than ever actually focusing on the genre, and there's a variety of different types of horror games that you can play, and you can get your hands on them with relative ease. I hope you enjoyed this look back into the history of survival horror, because I definitely enjoyed talking about it. This was a video that I've been wanting to make for a long time. I tried to cover as much as I could and give a nice overview of the genre, but if there are things that I left out or I missed, please leave a comment and let me know. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and drop a like on it. And while you're here, go ahead and let me know what is your favorite horror game. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.